So what he's going to talk about here, notice, is causality and causation, right? And when we talk about causes, methodological naturalism says if we're going to do it scientifically, we only can explain or have causes that are natural, right? So that means we can't have personal causes, or causality is what what it's often referred to. And of course, obviously, he's going to take issue with that, as we would expect he would. He says there's been some controversy as to which field that is the proper place to turn to in order to seek professional expertise in resolving this debate with regard to theistic evolution, intelligent design, and the notion of methodological naturalism. He says, nor is the question of professional expertise merely an academic matter of turf protection, because currently it is largely scientists and science educators who are the gatekeepers for the public schools in this area, right? So they call the shots, they say what gets in and what gets out. And he says, actually, the issue here is not controversial at all, even though, it's a controversy. He says the issue really isn't controversial, since the central topics do not involve how to practice science, which requires familiarity with instrumentalization and procedures and that kind of stuff, right? But the central topics involve how to define science and distinguish it from non-science or pseudoscience. That's the issue. And those, again, he's going to argue here, are not determined by scientific methods, right?
Right. Again, we can't titrate it. We can't break it apart to its different elements. This tends to be a philosophical one.
Right. How do we know that this particular notion or set of procedures or whatever is non-scientific and this one is scientific, right? How do we know why do we say astrology is a pseudoscience and astronomy is real science? How do we make a distinction between those? Where does that come from? Well, those aren't scientific questions. Those are philosophical questions, is what he's getting at here.
Right. Well, to understand this debate and the proper field of study for resolving it, we must first make a distinction between first and second order issues. A first order issue is a topic of science about some phenomenon, e.g. how to predict earthquakes or manipulate chemical reaction rates. And the second order issues is the topic of philosophy about science itself, such as its methods, its nature, its differences from other fields. So those are the two. The first tends to be kind of what you think of when you think of doing science experiments, right?
Yeah.
Like doing the science is there. But the second order is there for when you're talking about the more higher level concepts of, what does it mean to have a nature and stuff like that.
Right. So it's the doing science versus talking about doing science. Right. That's the second one. Yeah.
So now the question of how to define science is clearly a topic for philosophers and historians of science. This is not to say that scientists and others cannot be a part of this discussion. In fact, it would be probably wrong of us to not include scientists into the history of science. It's merely to affirm that when they participate, they will largely be dealing with philosophical issues, which they are not professionally trained in.
Yeah. Good. And so what have we come to here with regard to this chapter? Well, he says in his conclusion that in this chapter we have seen that other branches of inquiry besides science, in particular philosophy, provide knowledge of reality that's either completely independent of scientific discoveries, right, the authority thesis, or more authoritative than science, right? Actually, that is the authoritative thesis. So the first one is the autonomy thesis. He says two things of great importance for Christians follow from these theses. First, philosophy has always been considered a handmaiden, a servant of theology. And so when the theologians and biblical scholars work with philosophers to make a carefully presented and defended thesis about the world, we should, he says, not automatically accept the scientific claim and revise the Bible to harmonize with the latest science. Notice, where is he getting that from? Well, because philosophy and therefore theology have authority and are autonomous in their own light. That's where he's getting that from. And so they don't automatically have to fold for science when they make claims about the world and the reality of what's going on in the world. So that's the first thing. Rather, he says, he shows that this chapter demonstrates that we often have more rational evidence and authority for the carefully developed theological claims than science do for their conflicting claim, right? So that's the notion here that he wants us to see. The authority and autonomy of philosophy gives Christians also a notion of authority and autonomy just from the logical argument, because they are considered the handmaiden, right? And so theology is, and so therefore, it's philosophy. Since philosophy does this, then the theology does it as well.
We can be the bride sometimes. It's never always being the bridesmaid, but that's right.